Taking a closer look at what appears to be a decisive shift in how the United States of America is projecting power on the world stage. From military action in Venezuela to renewed U.S. interest in Greenland to the seizure of Russian and Venezuelan oil tankers at sea and even a selective easing and tightening of sanctions on Moscow, the Trump administration seems to be advancing a foreign policy driven less by norms and more by national interest. Supporters argue this marks the end of costly forever wars. Critics warn it's rewriting the rules of sovereignty, trade, and the use of force, setting precedents that rivals like Russia and China could soon exploit. To help us unpack what this means, I'm now joined by Dr. Nicholas Redman, Director of Analysis and Editor-in-Chief at Oxford Analytica. Nicholas, thanks for joining us this afternoon here on Breaking Ground. Dr. Nicholas, I want to ask you first up, looking at Venezuela, looking at Greenland, the tanker seizures and sanctions together, are we seeing a new U.S. doctrine taking shape?
I think that's exactly the question to ask. It's also a period of real volatility and fluidity right now, and things might look different in a few weeks, but I think we have to draw a line between the world before January 3rd and the world after it. Before January 3rd, we knew that this was an administration that was very skeptical about international law, international organizations, rules, cooperation. We saw that with the departure from the COP15 treaty on climate, and had quite a skeptical view of alliances, not alliances per se, but how alliances were practiced. The idea that actually alliances needed to be rebalanced in order to favor the United States. And this America First doctrine is one that is basically a zero-sum view of the world. And so if U.S. interests are favored more, then other countries are going to have to lose out more. So all that was very clear running up to January 3rd. But what has happened on January 3rd is a shake to one of the other assumptions we had, which is that Donald Trump was very wary about using military force. He came into office promising, as you noted, an end for forever wars. He only used military force very selectively and in a limited way in Iran, and then drew a line underneath it. But what we're seeing now is a rather different approach to international wars. A president that said that tariff wars were easy to win, preferred to use economic coercion, now seems to be a new convert to the utility of military force.
So then, Dr. Redman, is this doctrine, would you best describe it as transactional power taking precedence over rules and values at this point?
Yes, I think that's very clear. If there are rules and values in place, they're US ones, not universal ones. You actually saw that in the justification for Nicolas Maduro's removal. It was about US law and US interests. Those were the ones that were advanced as the justification.
And Venezuela's oil and Greenland's minerals are resources now openly driving U.S. foreign policy. Would you agree? And if you do, why?
So the administration has made it very clear that access to minerals is going to be vital to U.S. economic security. If you look at Venezuela, it wasn't only about the minerals. Remember that this military buildup started really in August of last year. And the narrative varied somewhat across, but drugs were a very big part of it, not necessarily because Venezuela is a huge player in the drugs trade, but because the United States administration wished to signal that this was not going to be a business as usual approach to the drug challenge the United States faces. So drugs was part of it, migration was part of it, both in terms of people coming into the United States, but the possibilities of repatriating the many, many Venezuelans that moved to the United States over the last 20 years. And then there was that broader question about the Western Hemisphere, the insistence the United States has on dominating that, on removing rival powers, building up the ranks of its own partners in the region and thinning out the ranks of its rivals. So there were multiple reasons behind Venezuela. The president personally really fixed on oil. That's why we're hearing a lot more about it now. But there were other interests in play, and it's not simply a case that the United States is only interested in resources.
Interesting. So would you say then that under the Trump regime, the U.S. is shifting from democracy promotion to asset protection?
Well, I think it's very clear that democracy promotion isn't part of the mix. If you go back and read the National Security Strategy, which was released in December last year, its most scathing criticism is actually for previous administrations and the fact that they were really headed in promoting universal values, acting in the world in order to actually advance interests other than American interests. So of all of the interests that we were talking about, all the potential reasons for engagement in Venezuela, the one that we did not hear at the Mar-a-Lago press conference on January 3rd was democracy promotion. There was the only mention of Maria Corina Machado is she's probably not got what it takes to become the president of Venezuela. And the man the United States recognized as the winner of the July 2024 election, Edmundo Gonzalez, didn't even merit a mention.
You know, Dr. Redman, I want to move to the big picture now. Was Venezuela, according to you, truly a limited operation or a model for future action?
Well, I think potentially it is both. It was a limited operation in that there wasn't an attempt to seize territory. There wasn't an attempt to remove the entire government of Venezuela. So the military limitation there, the military exposure was actually quite limited. As Donald Trump said, we're not afraid of boots on the ground, but actually it was only a few dozen boots on the ground and only for a few hours. So the United States did not expose itself in the way it exposed itself in Iraq. But I think that is precisely the point. The administration has learned the lessons from Iraq, and the lessons are don't go in and occupy a country because that takes huge amounts of blood and treasure and have massive risk. If you look at what they're trying to do in Venezuela, it is not regime change, it is regime co-optation. By removing Maduro, they're trying then not to replace the regime, not to install democracy, but to work with this government so that it's the responsibility of Delcy Rodriguez, not the United States, in order to run Venezuela, to keep Venezuela secure, to feed Venezuela's people.
Dr. Redman, I was reading a few articles where I did realize that in Trump's first regime, the media had mocked all his comments on Greenland. But now after Venezuela, should U.S. interests in Greenland be taken far more seriously?
Well, I don't need to offer an opinion. You've just got to look at the European reaction. They take it in deadly earnest right now. European allies are terrified about the prospect of the United States making some sort of move on Greenland. And Secretary of State Rubio said that next week he actually intends to talk to the Danish government about buying Greenland.
So is the Arctic now becoming perhaps a strategic battleground rather than a cooperative space then?
I think that's been the case actually for a while. This is not something that you can put squarely at the door of the Trump administration. China has shown a great interest in the Arctic, although it is not an Arctic power. It calls itself a near-Arctic power, and it has made strenuous efforts to assert a presence there. Russia also, as an incumbent Arctic power, very interested in developing the area as the Northern Sea route opens up more. It's made some military investments there already. So it's not only one power, it's not only the United States here. I think as the Arctic opens up, as it becomes more possible, and now that we have, the zeitgeist is partly around access to minerals now, right? This becomes very important. And the Arctic's mineral riches, as well as strategic advantages, I think almost inevitably, in a situation of international competition, not cooperation, is one of those regions that is very vulnerable to being securitized and to being militarized.
Right. Now, we've just spoken, I did refer to the tanker seizures. I want to understand from you, do tanker seizures mark a shift from sanctions enforcement to coercive force?
What I find strange or unusual, what challenges my assumptions about the tanker seizure is the circumstances around it. So this was a vessel that attempted to break the US imposed quarantine on shipping of Venezuelan oil, but did not do so. It was not attempting to do so. It was sailing the other way. It was actually seized much closer to Britain than to Venezuela when finally it happened. And it did so despite the fact that it had been reflagged as a Russian vessel, which technically meant that legally meant that it was under Russian sovereign protection. And despite the fact that there was a Russian naval escort, and the fact that Russia had requested specifically of the United States that it desist from chasing this vessel. So what that tells me is more about Trump's risk appetite, which actually, it says to me, is greater today than it was a week ago, and it was greater than when the Venezuela operation was being planned.
Interesting.
Remember, the Armada in Venezuela was assembled over many months. There was a massive military overmatch. Venezuela is militarily weak. It has few allies. Its distant supporters are half a world away. But to take on a Russian tanker that was really under Russian naval protection, that is a much more risky endeavor.
Absolutely.
That has higher upside risk, much less easy to plan. And so that, for me, is the most sort of interesting thing out of this. In a way, it's probably a signal that the United States is in deadly earnest about its domination of the Western Hemisphere.
Which leads me to my next... Yes, go ahead.
But it also has broader questions about what this says about U.S. resolve and changes in the U.S. approach to the utility of the use of force.
Which brings me to my next question, Dr. Redman, which is, would you say selective tightening and easing of Russian sanctions show leverage now matters more than rules?
Well, the sanctions are partly about enforcing certain international laws. I think it's worth underscoring that point. The United States has long used sanctions. It's been a leading proponent of them. The question is what Donald Trump wishes to do with Vladimir Putin. We know that he wants a peace in Ukraine. We know that he's been very frustrated that Putin hasn't really played along. I think one of the interesting questions that we have out of this, and all we have right now is questions, we have very few answers, is whether Donald Trump actually is going to show Putin that he is prepared to use military force, and whether that changes Putin's calculus about whether he can play the long game in Ukraine, string out the negotiations, but just wait till the day that through diplomacy he can get everything that he believes he can achieve militarily on a 2 to 3 year horizon.
This brings me to a very important question. This is one question that I had asked myself yesterday, Dr. Redman. If Russia or China copied these tactics, could the US credibly object, Doctor?
Well, there's credible objection is what people are actually going to do. And what is more is what people are going to do. I think the reading that we have out of the last 24 hours, and I think, let me just add this caveat. This is a really fluid situation. And 3 weeks from now, the utility of force in Venezuela might not look quite as impressive as it does today, because it depends on what the political consequences of this are. I'm not convinced yet that what was done with Nicolas Maduro is actually going to be sufficient in order to change Venezuelan government policy in ways that the United States really likes. It might be that further military action is yet needed. But nevertheless, we're in a moment where it looks like military action is a silver bullet that can solve all sorts of problems. So if that is the case, then what I think the United States is signaling is we have our sphere of influence, but that we reserve for ourselves the right to act in other parts of the world on the basis of our interests.
Right.
So I'm not sure that it actually does mean that any other power can do whatever it wants, because it still has to reckon with the United States. And if we're thinking about China and Taiwan,
yes,
the national security strategy drew a very, very thick red line around Taiwan.
But then wouldn't you say, Dr. Redman, in a way the US has lowered the global threshold for using force? It can't be that the US has one approach while it expects another approach from the rest of the world.
Exactly. All states can really do is mind their own behavior, but they cannot determine what precedents are set or how other states respond and interpret that. I think right now there will be responses and reactions, but at the moment, the response, I suspect, from most of the world is one of shock and of hesitation, perhaps a slow building anger, but right now the United States looks like the sort of power that you really do not want to mess with.
But Dr. Redman, has Donald Trump really thought this through in the long term is my question. Doesn't this weaken Washington's case against countries like Russia and China?
So the argument is that it's no longer about international law, but it is about a balance of power between states, and the United States is the most powerful state in the world. That, if you read the national security strategy, I encourage everyone to do it. That's what it says. It says we're not really in a world of laws, norms, rules, institutions. We're in a world where great powers are the ones that make the weather.
But doesn't this doctrine then deter rivals, does it? Or invite escalation is the question?
Well, it seeks to deter rivals, but what the longer-term consequences of this might be, we don't know. And I would just come back to an earlier point. Right now, it looks like the United States is newly enamored of the use of military force and feels quite free to do so. But if the consequences of this show that this initial assessment that it is very successful, it has very low cost, if that assessment changes, then future behavior is going to change.
I have two more questions for you before I let you go, Dr. Redman. Is this approach stabilizing the global order or making it more volatile? I think this is the question of the hour, sir.
Well, if we think the global order is partly about rules, norms of behavior, and that larger countries accept some limitations on what they do, no.
All right, but waking up to Trump 2.0 every morning here in India, we're seeing so many new headlines, some shocking us, some surprising us. How much of this global order has been impacted by Trump 2.0 is the question.
Well, on climate, we've already seen a massive change because one of the world's largest and most wealthy countries is no longer part of that. There might be other. We know that the WTO is dead as a dispute resolution mechanism because the United States has no wish to participate in it. So we've already had some changes on those spheres. The only thing I would caution is it's really not clear yet what Trump's base thinks about some of these military adventures, and the midterms are coming. But it might be that actually it's domestic restraints that have more strength here, more currency than the external ones, certainly more than the normative ones that you just referred to in terms of international law, rules, norms, expectations of behavior.
I believe I have a minute left, so my last question to you, and I promise this will be my last question to you, is can Trump really justify this as all being done under national interest?
Well, this is exactly the justification he's making. Although if we go back to the Mar-a-Lago press conference, he also says that Venezuela is going to be governed in ways that will actually suit the Venezuelan people as well. America first and Venezuela first too. So in terms of the narrative, it is also that other boats can be floated in addition to the United States one. But it underscores also that operation was very heavily couched as a domestic security operation, a law enforcement operation, not an out-and-out exercise of military power. And I think that speaks to some of the domestic constraints and domestic sensitivities that ultimately might be the real limiter on what the United States does in the near future.
Dr. Nicholas Redman, thank you for joining me here on Breaking Ground and for that analysis. What's clear from our conversation is that this moment goes far beyond any one country, touching energy security, territorial ambition, economic coercion, and the rules governing the use of force. Whether this new US doctrine restores American leverage or reshapes the global order is far more unpredictable in many ways. It's a question that the world is grappling with at this point. Thank you for your time this afternoon.